Welcome back to SciInsights. Don't forget to subscribe.
Threshold 5 brings us life. What is life? Though there may be many other life forms in the universe, we can only study those that emerged on our planet. So from now on, we focus on our home planet, the Earth. All living things on Earth share important qualities. First, they take in energy from outside to maintain themselves. This is metabolism. Second, they all seem to constantly try to balance the conditions inside and outside themselves in order to survive as long as possible. This is called homeostasis. Third, they can make copies of themselves through reproduction because they all contain huge molecules of DNA or RNA that record how they were made. And fourth, over time, the information in those molecules can change so that later generations may be slightly different. And in this way, living things slowly diversify. Let's consider the ingredients and the Goldilocks conditions needed for life to form. The ingredients are a great variety of complex chemical compounds, including DNA and RNA. Two Goldilocks conditions provide ideal environments for these chemical compounds to combine in many different ways. First, you need energy to fuel those chemical reactions, but not too much, since that would just blast molecules apart. And second, you need a liquid. That's because it's hard for atoms to link up in gases where they are too far apart, or in solids where they can't move very much. So where could we find these Goldilocks conditions? Well, liquids can only exist in a narrow range of temperatures. If the temperature's too high, like right next to a star, then liquids turn into gases. If the temperatures are too cold, like in deep space, liquids turn into solids. Some rocky planets or moons are just the right distance from their suns to have lots of liquid water. They also have the right amount of energy to encourage chemical reactions. Here, on our Earth, 4 billion years ago, you would have found almost perfect conditions for some of the most complex chemistry you can imagine. That chemistry led to life.
Let's explore how life has changed and diversified since the emergence of organic molecules and basic cells. One way to view this process is through 6 mini-thresholds. A threshold is a sudden increase in complexity that gives rise to new emergent properties, new qualities. Consider each mini-threshold for yourself. Does it mark something new and different? And if so, why? Our first mini-threshold is photosynthesis. It's likely that the first prokaryotes evolved deep in the ocean near massive vents that provided them with chemical and heat energy. About 3.5 billion years ago, some cells migrated to the ocean's surface and evolved to use vastly more abundant energy from the sun. The process they developed to do this is called photosynthesis. It led to an energy bonanza, and that enabled life to spread to many more places. And since oxygen is created as a byproduct of photosynthesis, huge numbers of photosynthesizing prokaryotes over millions of years radically transformed our atmosphere from one rich in carbon dioxide to one richer in oxygen. Oxygen was poisonous for many species, so they died off. But new species emerged that could use oxygen's amazing chemical energy. Mini-threshold 2 is the emergence of eukaryotes about 2.5 billion years ago. These are more complex cells whose DNA is locked up inside a special case called the nucleus, which help protect and preserve vital genetic information. Eukaryotes also contain tiny organs called organelles. Like the organs in your body, they perform special functions such as photosynthesis or processing oxygen. This meant that eukaryotes could thrive in Earth's increasingly oxygen-rich atmosphere, while many prokaryotes perished. That's a pretty important development, since we are made entirely of eukaryotic cells. Around 1 billion years ago, we crossed mini-threshold number 3. the introduction of the first multicellular organisms. In the same way specialized organelles came together to form more complex eukaryotes, different eukaryotes came together to form even more complex life forms. These organisms could contain billions of cells, each with a different function, but all sharing the same DNA. So they worked together. With networks of specialized cells in cooperation, multi-celled organisms could respond to changes in the environment in entirely new ways, further developing a key survival trait of life that we call homeostasis. The development of brains is mini-threshold 4. Multi-celled organisms needed a way to coordinate all the activities going on inside them, and this became the work of special nerve cells. In some organisms, these cells began to cluster at the head and down the spinal cord to form the first brains. Organisms with brains could process much more information, and they could react to it in even more complex ways, which enabled richer and more sophisticated activities like thinking and perhaps even consciousness. Mini-threshold number 5 is when life moves from the ocean to land. From about 475 million years ago, some multicellular organisms, beginning with plants and fungi, left the oceans for land. There was a great incentive. This new environment was rich in new opportunities for organisms that could find ways to survive. But that was a challenge, though, as these organisms had to develop special skins to avoid drying out, special ways to breathe out of water, and new ways to reproduce. The modern equivalent would be humans trying to live in space. Mammals, the forerunners of you and me, account for mini-threshold number 6. The first animal to live on land may have been like a modern lungfish, but other land animals soon evolved, such as amphibians, but these still needed to return to the water to reproduce. Then came reptiles, like crocodiles or dinosaurs. These developed large, leathery eggs that could survive well away from water. Then, about 250 million years ago, the first mammals appeared on Earth, evolving from a branch of reptiles that loosely resembled birds. Mammals are warm-blooded, they're furry, and they don't lay eggs. And you and I are mammals. Does the appearance of mammals really count as a mini-threshold? Or is it just because we are mammals that we think so? What would be other candidates for mini-thresholds, by the way? The development of backbones? The ability to think? Or what about the concept of family?
Everything we've looked at has one quality in common. It's not alive. Now, and for the rest of this course, we're going to be looking at things that are alive, at living organisms. Biologists suspect that the universe is crawling with life, that there's life all through the universe, but the truth is we just don't know. The only place we know for sure that life exists is here on our Earth. So that's where we have to study it. Now, what is life? What makes life so distinctive? We all probably feel intuitively that we know what makes life different, but pinning it down precisely is actually very difficult indeed. Let's try a kind of crude comparison. Let's compare two big things. Let's compare an elephant and the Earth. Now, we could say the elephant moves, but we've seen that the Earth is kind of dynamic too. Or we could say the elephant grows. Well, even the young Earth sort of grew during the process of accretion. Or perhaps we could say that the elephant, like all living things, acts with a sort of purpose. Here I suspect we're getting nearer to the truth, but it's still hard to pin down for certain. What we can do is we can list some qualities that all living things seem to have. And in what follows, I'm going to describe 4 key qualities that all living things seem to possess. The first quality we call metabolism. All living organisms are made from cells. All cells can metabolize. And what we mean by that is that they can take in energy and materials from the outside world in order to maintain themselves and keep themselves going. Now, this complicated process is governed by instructions that are contained in the master molecule DNA, that's deoxyribonucleic acid, that is present in all cells. The second quality we call homeostasis. It's a complicated word, but it's worth getting on top of. By homeostasis, we mean the ability of all cells, and in fact all living organisms, to keep constantly adjusting to tiny changes in their environment using the energy and materials they get through metabolism. And homeostasis is also governed ultimately by instructions that you can find in the DNA. The third crucial quality is reproduction. However good they are at homeostasis, eventually all cells, all living organisms, break down and die. But it's here that life's come up with a really clever trick for preserving itself. Even when the individual dies, before it dies, it can make copies of itself and its DNA and scatter those copies around it. So the individual may die, but the copies will survive. And that's reproduction. The fourth quality we call adaptation. Over many generations, species can slowly change and adapt and diversify as environments change. The way they do this is actually strangely through mistakes in the copying of DNA. Just occasionally, DNA makes mistakes, but the copy works. And when that happens, and you get a new version that can actually do all these things, it can metabolize, it can do homeostasis, it can reproduce, we say that a new species has been created. It's almost as if DNA was slowly learning how to make new species that can do new things in new environments. And that's how we get the huge diversity of life all around us today. Metabolism, homeostasis, reproduction, and adaptation seem to reinforce each other. They sort of go together. Metabolism provides the energy and materials needed for the constant tiny adjustments of homeostasis and also for reproduction. What adaptation does is allow species to make large adaptations, large changes over time as environments change. And that's the key to evolution. Homeostasis and adaptation together explain why life always seems purposeful, because it's as if it's pushing back somehow against the environment. Now, as far as we know, only living things are capable of combining all of these four qualities. So what is it that holds them together, that links them? The answer is the astonishing molecule that we call DNA. You've seen already that DNA seems to play a crucial role in all the four qualities that we suggested may define life. How does it work, and how is it formed? Well, the best way of thinking about DNA is to think of it as being a bit like the software in your computer. DNA contains the instructions needed to make the proteins that go into the cell and do the crucial work needed to keep the cell going. And it also contains the information needed for DNA to reproduce and for the whole cell to reproduce. How's it constructed and how does it work? Well, DNA is a vast molecule with billions of atoms in it. And they're organized in two great chains. Each chain has arms, and those arms link up to form like the rungs of a ladder. So the whole thing ends up looking like a ladder. Then it twists on itself to form a double helix, and that folds up compactly at the center of the cell. But this is how it works. The information is contained on the arms of the ladder in a special 4-letter code. Molecules inside the cell approach the DNA, unzip the crucial part, read off the code, and then go back into the cell and make the proteins necessary to do what the DNA needs it to do. DNA can also copy itself. This is how that works. The two parts of the ladder separate, and each of the arms goes off into the sludge of chemicals around it and finds its counterpart until eventually you have two identical double strands of DNA. And that's how DNA copies itself, and that's the basis of reproduction in all living organisms. DNA is at the center of our modern understanding of how life works. But even in the 19th century, the English naturalist Charles Darwin had generated a broad understanding of how these changes occur, of how life evolves. Before Darwin's time, most naturalists believed that species were fixed. They didn't change over time. But some had studied fossils, and that seemed to mean that species actually did change over time. The question was, how? That was the question that Darwin tried to tackle. Now, Darwin knew that animal breeders can actually change species quite quickly within just a few generations. And the way they do it is by choosing which individuals will breed and which won't. So if you want to breed fat sheep, you let the fat sheep breed and you don't let the thin sheep breed. And by doing that, quite quickly, you can really change an animal or a species. Now, what Darwin noticed is that something very similar seems to happen in the natural world. It's almost as if nature itself selects which individuals will breed and which won't. Think, for example, of an eagle. Think of an eagle with really good eyesight. It's going to get plenty of food, it's going to reproduce. And think of another eagle that has very poor eyesight. It's going to really struggle, and its chances of reproducing are rather poor. So what this means is that the eagle with really good eyesight is likely to have many more offspring, and slowly over time its qualities will become more and more common, and that particular group of birds is going to change and become more like the eagle with good eyesight. Now, repeated many, many times over thousands or millions of generations, this, Darwin realized, is the mechanism that changes life. Nature is selecting which individuals will breed. He called this mechanism natural selection. And he figured out that it's the key to the evolution of life. Evolution, it turns out, is a never-ending process because the environment keeps changing, so species keep changing. There's no end to it at all. Now, when Darwin first came out with his theory, it was received with considerable skepticism in 19th century Britain. He actually came up with lots of evidence, but not quite enough, and some things he really didn't understand. For example, he hadn't a clue about the role of DNA. But since then, a lot of new evidence has come to make his theory much, much more powerful. Until today, it's the dominant idea in modern biology. Now, we encourage you to study the evidence. First, look at the evidence available to Darwin, and the best way of doing that is to read his wonderful book, The Origin of Species. It's very readable, it's a classic, it's really worth looking at. And then look at the evidence that's kicked in since then. Now, it's really worth doing this because Darwin's idea and coupled with our modern ideas about how DNA works, are really the key to understanding life and how it works.
Thanks for watching.